The national topic for 2023 is ranked choice voting, or RCV. However, as one coach on r/debate noted, it may be a great policy topic rather than a great debate topic. In other words, it is AF biased. However, coming off of the biometrics topic, I think you'll find it, well, at least a bit more balanced. In short, ranked choice voting is great for many reasons related to democracy and representation and power concentration. It can help the people take back the government. However, messing with the key voting system we've been using forever in this country can be risky. In the short term, it may lead to confusion and disenfranchisement. In the long term, we don't really know the outcome. Now, in my eyes, ranked choice voting is obviously a good thing. It can end the concept of throwing your vote away on third-party candidates. It can take power away from both the Republican and Democratic parties. It can help to stop negative campaigning, help to mend the political rift in our country, and increase incentives for American citizens and their elected leaders to cooperate. Ranked choice voting will be beneficial to both liberals and conservatives, but more importantly, it will be beneficial to our country. However, in today's lecture, we will be talking about both sides, and I will present to you what evidence I have for your consideration. What's important for the RCV topic is evidence quality. The fact is, there's not a ton of evidence for either side, and studies and surveys from the places that do use RCV often disagree with each other, so many of the best arguments are somewhat theoretical. That means you'll hear unsubstantiated arguments on both sides. Let me explain. As a debate class warm-up, you can have two students discuss an absurdly simple topic, like cats versus dogs or peaches versus cherries. Now, students can easily provide arguments, although both sides are actually absurd. Dogs are not objectively better. It depends on the context and preferences. Now, while you as a debater might not buy into my frame that cherries are better than peaches, a child might be offended if I say that cherries are more nutritious than peaches and therefore better. However, when it comes to politics, partisan writers are equally likely to make up these kinds of arguments that kind of seem to make sense but are actually absurd, but that are designed to fool adults, not just to fool children. So don't be fooled. Again, focus on the quality of evidence. Science, okay, in part it's a big scam, but in general, I'm trusting a PhD over a professional think tank writer, and I think you should do the same. And if you can provide a gold standard meta-analysis or a number of peer-reviewed studies that agree with each other, you can use evidence quality as a weighing mechanism during today's debate rounds. For that, of course, you can start with the debate track brief listed in the description below. Now, let's begin. A few notes about evidence before we begin. First, laundry lists. This month's topic, like many others, has several great laundry list cards. These are persuasive essays that list a number of arguments for one side or the other. These essays are great to pull quotes from, even if they don't go in-depth on any particular argument. In fact, there's no real reason you couldn't just make your case a 4-minute reading of one of these laundry list cards. I'm not saying that you should, but I am saying there's no rule against it that I know about anyway. Next, the alt card. I often include alt plan or counter plan cards. I've included one this time on why majority voting is better than ranked choice voting. I think these cards are interesting to give you a better lay of the land and serve as a powerful reminder to any judges that ranked choice voting is just one of many systems. I don't recommend running counter plans in public forum. It is against the rules. It's also kind of tacky. So use this card mainly for informational purposes. It can be used in rebuttals, in crossfire. Don't run it as an argument. Next, responses. Again, as usual, the debate track brief contains quite a few AT cards. These can be used as blocks in your case or as rebuttals on opponents' cases. For the sake of time, we won't cite them in this lecture. Last, bibliography. So if you need more evidence, I've linked a bibliography in the description of this video, a large body of RCV work going back to the 1920s by Vote Guy, Jack Stentucci. If you're getting real serious about this topic, I imagine there is some gold, probably a lot of rocks, in that evidence mine. All right. First, we will cover voting background, including definitions and the status quo, and in ranked choice voting before moving on to aff arguments, finally neg arguments. So background, again, on the status quo. Here is how the status quo works. You are almost all under 18 years old and have almost all never voted, so I'll tell you briefly how it works. First, you register to vote, usually with your city or county after you turn 18. Next, you go to a polling place. This is often an administrative building or a school. They may ask for an ID, maybe specifically a photo ID or not. It depends on the state. Every state's a little bit different. Then you go and make your choice. Which president do you want? Which governor do you want? Which mayor? Which drain commissioner? Maybe you have one choice. In that case, vote for them or don't. Doesn't matter. They'll win either way. Or you have two choices. You pick your favorite, or three, pick your favorite, or four, pick your favorite. In all cases, just pick whoever you want to run in that office. Quick pitch for voting. Vote 411 and sites like it. There are quite a few sites like it, but I like Vote 411. It makes it very easy to compare candidates side by side. Voting can be fun. Your vote does count, remember, sometimes, if you live in the right area of a purple state, or if you're voting in local elections, which I encourage you to do. So give it a shot once you're of age. I used to not vote. At least the first election I was eligible for, I did not vote, but then after voting afterwards, I'm super into it now. I really like it. I think I can give a good pitch for it. Now, every state is a tad different, every district is a tad different, but for the most part, that's your status quo. That's how elections work for now. Welcome to voting. A little bit more, though, on background. Some definitions. These are all for the status quo. We'll do RCV definitions later. Plurality versus majority. Our current system uses plurality voting. In most states, that means whoever gets the most votes wins. Simple. This is also called first past the post voting, FPTP, also FPP, and FPPV. We need to standardize, but we have not. An example, 3 candidates are running. We'll call them Abel, Bart, and Candace. If the split goes 30, 30, 40, then Candace wins. Even though it seems like only 40% of voters actually want her to win. She only got 40% of the vote, but more than the other two. That's plurality, she wins. And majority. In a majority, you need more than 50% of the total votes to win. So you need 50% plus 1, more than 50%. In such a system, Bart here would only win if he got more than half of the votes, not just if he got more votes than the other two, as in plurality voting. Must be 50% or more. Next definition, a spoiler candidate. Under plurality, our current voting strategy, let's imagine another example. Okay, we have 2 candidates, Republican and Democrat. The Republican gets 55% of the vote, Democrat gets 45%, Republican wins. Easy. Now imagine 3 candidates. We have Robert, the Republican, Denny, a Democrat, and Lily, a Libertarian. Pretend Republicans prefer the Libertarian candidates, say 15% of all Republican voters, like them more than the Republican candidate. After all, Republicans are not a monolith. We're not a monolith! Many prefer personal freedoms to whatever the Republicans are currently offering. So now, 15% vote Libertarian, 45% vote Democrat, but only 30% vote Republican. Lily the Libertarian, in other words, stole 15% of the vote from Robert the Republican. So now, with no stolen votes, Denny the Democrat wins. In this example, Lily the Libertarian is a spoiler candidate, because if she hadn't been in the race, the outcome would have been different. A Republican would have won instead of a Democrat. Next, federal elections. Those are elections for the country. At federal elections, you vote for president. Of course, you know that, but you also vote for Congress. Every state in the union gets 2 congressional senators, that is supposed to represent state rights. And also, every state in the union gets a number of representatives. The House of Representatives, which is based on state population. That's supposed to represent the people. A side note, if you ever go to your state capital, which you should, because they're almost always beautiful, and you can meet the governor sometimes, depending on your state, you'll see 2 houses, the upper house, lower house, analogous to the Senate and House of Representatives. In my opinion, I think they're kind of trying a little bit too hard, but that's just me. Let me give a tad more context to the status quo. The current voting system that we use, including who is allowed to vote, doesn't come out of a vacuum, and there's nothing inherent about us as people that makes it this way. For example, there's plenty of people we don't allow voting, like felons and children. Why? I don't know. Or animals. Maybe one day they'll get a vote as well. This is not a lecture on voting history. That would take several more hours to at least scratch the surface. But here's a couple things you might hear in the evidence. 14th Amendment guarantees rights to all regardless of gender. Women are allowed to vote. 19th Amendment gives rights to all races. It doesn't matter where you're from or what your skin color is. If you're a U.S. citizen, you are allowed to vote. 26th Amendment gives rights to all ages above 18. And did I miss something? Probably so much, but we have got to move on. Let's talk about parties. So America has two main political parties, the Democrats and the Republicans. Democrats are thought of as more left or progressive. Republicans are thought of as more right or traditional. Now, that's not how it is in all countries. In some countries, there's 3 parties, or 5, or 10, where each party gets some members actually elected to the government, not just the 2 main parties. And in some countries, the divide is more simple. The left is for the people, the right is for business, the only war is the class war. However, for whatever our 2 parties are, again, another discussion, the Republican and Democratic parties don't really come from a vacuum. There could be many reasons for having 2, and only 2, main parties. Could be the powerful in both parties may benefit from the 2-party system, so they don't want any change. There may be natural urban-rural or north-south splits in the country, or there could certainly just be institutional momentum, right? We started doing this a while ago for whatever reason, and we haven't stopped because it's just hard to change big, complicated, bureaucratic institutions. However, my favorite explanation is de Fourier's law. I think you'll hear this a lot throughout these debate rounds, which states that first-past-the-post voting systems, like the one we have right now, are just more likely to lead to 2 parties. According to this theory, if we want more than 2 parties, we'll have to change our voting system. So, we do have a solution, and it is ranked choice voting. Let's touch on districts and also gerrymandering. A district is any area which the populace elects a national representative. Again, U.S. Congress, 2 parts, Senate, House of Representatives. Each state gets 2 senators, and each state gets anywhere from 1 to 52 representatives, depending on how many people are in that state. So, in the most populous state, California, there are 52 different sections, each of which elects 1 representative to the House. So that's a district, an area where the voting people count to elect a representative. Gerrymandering. Here it is with some simple examples. Pretend you are a Democrat in Ohio, and pretend there's some areas of your state that are more likely to vote for you than for the Republicans. In particular, you are looking at the people who live along Lake Huron. Lake Huron is subject to climate change effects. Democrats care more about climate change effects. Therefore, the people in that area will be likely to vote for you, a Democrat. Here's Lake Huron and the district in question. However, here's a problem. There's some Republican areas nearby. If the district map included those cities, you might not get elected. If it only included the Lake Huron bordering areas, you're good. You'll always be elected by those folks. So you, as a lawmaker in the state, have an incentive to make sure that particular Democratic sections of the state are one district. And this is gerrymandering. Here are all of the districts. Gerrymandering is drawing these maps like this to help you out and to not help the other party out. And I'm not saying that the representatives are holding the pen, but obviously the representatives are one part of a huge apparatus, a huge machine of party control, which certainly exerts its force. The most powerful people in any state definitely try to help themselves, is what I'm saying, I suppose. So here is Ohio, and that district we just mentioned. Pretty wonky drawing, if you ask me. Mississippi, just look at those wild blue tendrils. There is no way that is natural. Or Texas, the 2nd district, which would be impossible for Republicans to win, except they made the maps, so they totally do win. Republicans and Democrats both engage in gerrymandering, changing election maps in favor of themselves. However, some states and some districts are more heavily biased than others, so it's not like it's just corruption across the board. It's like levels of corruption across the board. All right, primaries. A general election is the normal election we're all used to. Trump versus Biden, Trump versus Clinton, Obama versus Romney. But how did Obama or Clinton become the Democratic representative? How did Trump or Romney become the Republican representative? That is the role of the primary election. In primary elections, registered members of the Democratic Party can vote for which of a slew of candidates they want to represent the Democrats in the general election. Same for Republicans. Who do registered Republicans want to put head-to-head with the Democratic representative? Primary elections are essentially pre-election elections. You are choosing your party's hero to fight against the other party's hero. An open primary means that anyone, whether a registered Democrat, Republican, or anyone else, can vote on whom the party elects as their hero. About half of US states have open primaries, although rules are different for each state. Now, does it make sense for just anyone to be able to vote in a Republican or Democratic primary? Maybe yes, maybe no, but it certainly seems more democratic, as we'll find out later in the video. Although if you are a hardcore party insider, you probably don't like these. All right. Runoffs. A runoff election is held in some states for their general and in some states for their primary elections if no one candidate gets 50% or more of the votes. So instead of selecting the plurality winner with 35 or 45% of the vote, the voters return to the polls to choose between the top two candidates. Now, runoffs can ensure a candidate wins the majority vote because you need over 50, but less people tend to vote in the runoffs. So as we'll talk about later, it's hard to get people to vote, and you can imagine it's even harder to get them to vote twice, which runoffs necessitate. So that is the background and definitions for the status quo. Let's move on to background and definitions for ranked choice voting. Ranked choice voting allows you to choose your favorite candidate plus several backup candidates for your vote to count towards if your favorite does not win. Here is an explanation from fairvote.org, the biggest organizational proponent of ranked choice, on how it works.
So what is ranked choice voting? In most parts of the United States, voters select a single candidate for each position on their ballot, and the candidate with the most votes wins. This is known as single-choice winner-take-all, which can sometimes result in the election of a candidate who earned only a small percentage of the vote, even when the majority of voters supported other candidates. But that's not the only way of electing our leaders. Ranked choice voting is another voting method which allows voters to rank their candidates in order of preference. In a ranked choice voting election, a candidate needs to earn more than half of the votes to win. All first choices are counted, and if a candidate has a majority, then they win, just like any other election. If not, the candidate with the fewest votes is eliminated, and voters who picked that candidate as number one will have their votes count for their next choice. This process continues until a candidate earns a majority and is declared the winner. Let's look at an example. Here, you select orange as your first choice candidate, yellow as your second, pink as your third, and green as your final choice. The first choices are counted. Yellow earned 35%, orange 21%, pink earned 28%, and green earned 16% of the vote. Because nobody won more than 50%, the candidate with the fewest votes is eliminated, and voters who picked him as their first choice have their ballots count for their second choice. This continues until a candidate receives more than half of the votes, or 50% plus 1.
As you can see, this process makes it far more likely that your vote will actually count, rather than being thrown away on a third party or even on a major party that doesn't win. Let's look at some definitions. First, exhausted ballot. This definition is from NCSL 22. They provide a bunch of great definitions in our evidence. Quote, when a ranked choice ballot becomes inactive and cannot be advanced in the tabulation for a contest because there are no further valid rankings on the ballot. Exhausted ballots are not necessarily cast by mistake. The voter could have intentionally left some candidates unranked. So an example. In a pool of 5 candidates, you are allowed 2 votes, and you vote for Tabitha McChester and Greenie Holloway. However, they are both eliminated first, so by the third round of tabulation, your ballot is exhausted. You don't have other choices to go towards in the ballot count. This is also called an exhausted vote. Next, truncated ballot. A truncated ballot happens when you don't vote for the maximum number of allowed candidates. Example, you are allowed to pick 5 choices, but you only pick 2 or 3. This is more likely to lead to an exhausted ballot, because if you'd picked all 5, one of your choices would more likely be in the running in the final tabulation. This is also called an undervote. A spoiled ballot, this is not unique to RCV, but also relevant. A spoiled ballot contains errors, which prevent it from being counted. Example, an overvote, so you pick too many candidates, or you rank some candidates, but you don't put a number 1 spot. You need that number 1 spot in order for it to count at all. Or you draw a leprechaun on the ballot instead of ranking candidates. These would all be spoiled ballots. Can't actually use that for counting. A proportional or multi-winner RCV. Most states choose one winner, whichever candidate exceeds the 50% mark first. However, these races can also be run to choose multiple candidates. So you could elect 2 candidates where the threshold is over 1/3 of the votes, or 3 candidates where the threshold is over 25% of the votes, etc. The map we looked at earlier with those districts in the state, essentially you just combine some of the districts. So now not one district elects 1 representative, but maybe 2 or 5 or 10. Saxena 22, quote, with proportional RCV, seats are allocated based on proportional representation, and combined with RCV, majority rule is enforced, and minority power is respected as well, end quote. Condorcet winners. A Condorcet system is a slightly different way to count votes. So instead of looking at the absolute number of votes each candidate gets, you look at their relative standing. So you put each pair of candidates head-to-head in a runoff. Whichever candidate wins that runoff based on how many people like them is declared the winner. And then whoever gets the most runoff wins between those head-to-head contests is the winner of the whole election. That is technically the candidate that most voters prefer. Now, it isn't that important that you understand this difference, but it will come up in the literature, so that's what it means. It's just a different way of counting the ranked choice voting votes. Final definition is negative campaigning. In our status quo of first past post elections, one way you might beat your rivals is to make people think they're a bad candidate or a bad person. Maybe their voting record is bad, their experience is inadequate, they may lack moral character, they're too old. All of these are examples of negative campaigning. If your opponent looks bad, you will look better in comparison. This negative campaigning is a big reason why Americans tend to hate the other team, because the messages we get from the media are made to trash the other side. In a ranked choice system, the incentives for negative campaigning disappear, or at least are reduced. If you trash talk your opponent, the voters who put that candidate in their number 1 spot and therefore really like them will not put you in their number 2 spot. Because why would you reward someone who's talking smack about your favorite candidate? Instead, a better voting strategy would be to reach out to these voters and request their number 2 or number 3 spot. Hey, I really like that guy, but I'm good as well. Give me number 2 or number 3. So that even if you can't get the number 1 vote, you still have a vote that could count. Let's look at what this kind of positive campaigning can look like in action.
Hello, I'm Mark Eaves.
And I'm Betsy Sweet. And in this upcoming governor's race, we are competitors, but we have been longtime allies.
The good thing is, and the lucky part is, we have ranked choice voting. So you get to vote for all 7 Democratic candidates.
And we believe that the only way the Democrats are going to win in November is if we elect a strong progressive. And you've got 2 of us right here.
That's right. And just today, the Working Families Party endorsed both of us, which we're really proud of.
Yeah, and we also both have the certification of Moms Demand Action for Gun Safety. So it's not just us that think we're progressive. You know us from our work, but there's a lot of other people who recognize it too. And this is our time.
So on June 12th, you can vote for me first and Betsy second,
or me first and him second. And you can be assured that we will have a strong progressive leader and we will all move Maine forward together.
That's right. We got to turn it around. Make sure you vote on June 12th.
Don't forget.
Okay, now a bit more context about RCV before we move on to arguments. International use. RCV is in use nationwide in New Zealand, Ireland, Malta, as well as Australia, which has famously used RCV for 100 years. Here is Code 19, quote, Australia's ranked choice system suits voters well enough that there is almost no discussion of alternative electoral systems. And then Code quotes Benjamin Riley, quote, Both voters and politicians are very used to the idea of rankings and would probably see a system which did not allow that as lacking something and maybe even illegitimate, end quote. Comparisons between the US and Australia are plentiful. They're both former British colonies, they're both English-speaking, they're both rich, they're both large continental countries. Australia is a stable democracy with extremely high voter turnout, so maybe we should be doing what they do, right? But, to be fair, showing up to vote in Australia is mandatory under pain of fine, so you can't really directly compare the two systems. Next, the growing popularity. Why are we talking about RCV now? Its popularity has been growing recently. Here's a quote from NBC 23. The past year saw not only an expansion in the use of ranked choice systems, but also increased interest in instituting it more widely. And in 2023, legislatures in at least 14 states will consider bills that would move them to this increasingly popular model. End quote. The most famous states to use RCV are Alaska, since 2020, and Maine, since 2018. In fact, these two states will use RCV in the next federal election. Bet you know what's coming up next. So, I have to talk about both sides, but in fact, I really only believe in AF. This is one of very few topics that inspires me. Maybe I will quit my job and campaign for RCV instead. Ranked choice voting is a simple intervention to change the system of corruption and power concentration that Americans on both sides of the aisle are sick of. RCV can end negative campaigning, empower diversity in candidates, help independent and third-party candidates, and help to heal political polarization. The result will be a government that is once again for the people and by the people. First, let's talk about benefits to society. Ranked choice voting will increase voter turnout, better represent the will of the people, and help to slow or end the political polarization that makes American politics so tense and volatile. Our first argument is turnout. In the status quo, turnout is a major issue. Many eligible Americans just don't vote. If the people don't vote, our democracy only represents a few people. Turnouts for presidential elections are only in the 50 to 60% range. Why? Well, people have obligations. School, work, childcare, barriers like transportation issues, or they would rather just relax in their free time rather than go vote, and they just don't care about politics, But also, many people think their vote doesn't count. And the problem with that is they're right. With gerrymandering, the primary process, and two-party control without real independent choices, your vote really doesn't count that much. But there is a solution. Ranked choice voting. Theoretical reasons to suspect it would increase turnout are plentiful. There's many that you can hear. But I'll just give you a practical one. According to NCSL 22, turnout increased by 22.3% in NYC mayoral elections when RCV was implemented. Another aspect that it will help with is runoffs. In elections with runoffs, voter turnout is even less. As we've mentioned, it's hard to get people to vote twice. As a result, runoff elections are usually determined only by dedicated voters. This is Kimball and Anthony, quote, "By compressing the voting and winnowing of candidates into one electoral election scheduled in November, RCV elections increase voter participation when compared to plurality, primary, and runoff elections," end quote. Specifically, RCV helps with youth turnout. RCV can particularly help with youth turnout. That's a good thing. For many reasons, older people are more likely to vote. So getting young people to vote can ensure that they have a say in the way the country is run and can turn them into lifelong voters. Quote, "Younger voters are more likely to vote in RCV cities. Findings suggest that RCV acts as a positive mobilizing force for youth voting through increased campaign contact," end quote. That is Julich and Cole, 21. Next argument, the will of the majority. In the status quo, first-past-the-post candidates can be elected with only 30% of the vote. Adding in the primary system and gerrymandering, even less of Americans actually decide our elections. Here's a quote from Toronto 22. "First, most of our elections are in safe districts that are effectively decided in primaries. Second, turnout in those primaries is very low. And third, those who do turn out are not very representative of the electorate as a whole. and so therefore, candidates and elected officials are rewarded for pandering to their base and punished for reaching across the aisle to solve problems, end quote. But you know what we have? We have a solution. RCV almost always ensures a majority, meaning that the candidate in office is approved of, if not the first choice of, more than 50% of voters. That's Steinberg 23. Peel Days 23 also says, quote, RCV encourages the election of candidates with the broadest electoral appeal. A factional candidate might get 30% of the vote, but if that candidate doesn't attract wider support, they will not succeed in an RCV system, end quote. So RCV helps us to truly elect people that we actually want to be our representatives. Next, on polarization. Our country is extremely polarized, with both extreme right and extreme left being empowered. The extremities of the right seem particularly terrifying to me and others, but remember that plenty of people are also terrified with the more out there ideas of the left. Again, because of our two-party system, this essentially is just Republicans and Democrats. Compromise and moderation are not valued in politics. Instead, every issue is treated like a slugfest for power, rather than a way to improve the state of the union and the lives of the people. But we have a solution: ranked choice voting. Here's Peter Singer, professor of bioethics at Princeton University, quote, in countries in which politics is becoming increasingly polarized, the Australian election should increase support for voting reform, end quote. Singer goes on to say that such reform would help to moderate extremism. Quote, extremism flourishes in voting systems in which the candidate with the most votes wins, even if the winner has the support of a minority of voters. Allowing voters to express their second or third preferences helps moderates defeat extremists, end quote. And many experts agree. The Politico 19 card in our evidence has a great deal of experts who believe RCV will help to solve polarization in America, including Anne-Marie Slaughter, CEO of New America, Francis Fukuyama, senior fellow at Stanford University, Larry Diamond, also a senior fellow at Stanford University, a great slate of academics who believe this will certainly do the job. One of the large triggers of polarization in America is negative campaigning. If all you hear about is how Republicans are dangerous and stupid, you probably won't like Republicans. And Americans hating each other just is not a great way to run a country. And RCV solves negative campaigning, as candidates appeal to their opponents' voters for second and third place spots. Here is text analysis that proves solvency. McGinn 20. Text-based sentiment analysis on mayoral debates indicates that the introduction of RCV, improved the civility of debates with candidates substituting negative or neutral words for positive words, end quote. Surveys confirm this finding. Donovan et al. 16, quote, people in cities with RCV are less likely to view campaigns as negative and less likely to respond that candidates were frequently criticizing each other, end quote. Therefore, ranked choice voting leads to less negative campaigning and less polarization. Next, on diversity. Ranked choice voting increases diversity in candidates and voters. Although I don't believe in fully proportional representation, and although diversity is certainly a loaded word, many of our politicians certainly do not represent us. And the majority of Americans want more political diversity in one way or another. Let's first talk about the spoiler effect. This is the mechanism of action. RCV removes the spoiler effect from the voting process. A big reason you wouldn't vote for a political outsider, a third-party candidate, or a not-so-popular woman or minority candidate is that you'd be throwing away your vote. It's better to spend your vote on whichever of the top two choices you prefer, rather than waste it on someone who certainly won't win. Under ranked choice voting, even if your favorite candidate doesn't win, a candidate who in the status quo has no chance of winning, your second or third choices can still ultimately go towards that more popular, acceptable candidate, and therefore your vote never gets wasted. Thus, under RCV, we'll have more women, more racial minorities, and more minor party candidates running. In the status quo, there's plenty of reasons for these groups to not run. First is negative campaigning, which might scare off most people, but is obviously way more scary if you know you will be attacked. And also, why waste your time, money, social capital, and effort if you know you won't win? Why should an openly gay or a trans candidate even bother running in Mississippi, where their campaign will just be attacks and failure? Here is Druffman and Stronto 21, quote, RCV allows newcomers and less traditionally electable candidates to run for second and third place rankings from opponents, including co-partisans, without being dismissed as spoilers. RCV changes campaign incentives in ways that can reduce the negativity and incivility. This kind of nasty campaigning can deter many qualified and talented people, especially women and women of color, from entering politics. That's Druffman and Stronto 21. The authors go on to note a couple of other studies showing this real impact at work. They quote Terrell and Lamedola's 2020 article, Women Win More in RCV Cities, and Stephen Hill's investigation. Around 60% of seats elected by preferential rules were won by ethnic minorities. Now, one major confounding factor here, RCV is only used now in progressive cities who want to try new things out. These are the same cities where women and racial minorities are more likely to run and get elected anyway. So that is something to note. Our next argument is the conservative case for RCV. Ranked choice voting is often seen as a progressive policy that favors Democrats, but there's an excellent essay by Barry Fagan on the conservative case for RCV. He notes that America keeps trending towards a bigger government, more spending, and moral degradation through both Democrat and Republican leadership. Clearly, the current system is not working for conservatives. We quote Fagan here. I've noted that conservatives support gradual, measured change. Two-party winner-take-all systems, by contrast, do not support incremental change, reasoned discussion, or compromise, and in fact tend to lend themselves to grand social engineering projects once a particular party gains enough power. Each time the other party gets in power, their agenda becomes more radical and more ambitious. This is not a system that conservatives should welcome, end quote. And we see RCV working out well for conservatives in many of the countries like Australia and Ireland that already use it. It's Olson 22. RCV is a politically neutral system that can tamp down extremism and help conservative values to flourish. Next, on governance. It is important that our government do a good job at governing. And again, RCV helps. First, on consensus, government is just more functional if two parties work together, or rather if all candidates, including independents, third parties, can work together to maintain and improve the country. Having more moderate candidates and less negative campaigning can help. By enforcing majority elections, RCV also ensures that the two-party preferred candidate is typically elected. Plurality voting cannot do the same. Again, that means more consensus amongst our leaders. In Australia, RCV helped to promote reciprocal exchanges between parties and broader systemic support for RCV. Such cross-partisan support helps explain the stability of RCV in Australia, with implications for the system's prospects in the US. End quote. That's Riley 21. So this quote just saying, both sides love it in Australia. Now, party control. RCV helps to reduce the iron grip that the Republican and Democratic parties hold over the political system. In the status quo, a small minority of voters holds all of the control because of the effects of primaries and gerrymandering. Here's Troiano 22, quote, right now, we have about 10% of the public electing more than 80% of Congress because of partisan primaries, and that's what produces a very unaccountable Congress, end quote. For that 10%, party insiders, they don't want the system to change. That would mean ceding control to more people. Here's Olson 22, quoting Andrew Prokop, quote, activists really like the current primary system because turnout is low, and it's easier for them to influence the outcome. Again, Troiano 22, there's bipartisan support and there's bipartisan opposition to reform, and the fault line is not based on party, it's based on power. On the one hand, you have those who want to protect their power at all costs, and on the other, you have leaders who want to put country over party, end quote. And again, the spoiler effect prevents third-party candidates from getting in. Ackerman and McCormick 21, quote, a poll of 50,000 Americans showed that nearly 70% want to see independents on the ballot to offer real competition to Democrats and Republicans. No matter how attractive an independent candidate may seem in the spring, summer, and early fall of an election year, he or she will be tarnished as a spoiler on election day and will almost certainly lose. This unfortunate situation reduces the supply of independent candidates willing to compete and perpetually forces America into one of two warring factions, end quote. In other words, the status quo helps to enforce the two-party system. RCV can help to break this stranglehold by increasing support for third-party candidates. Sims et al. 22. So in short, there's a great many reasons for the US to adopt ranked choice voting for its federal elections, and plenty of slam dunk cases that AF can develop with links into nearly anything that requires the two parties to work together, from staving off national and global economic troubles to bringing down the political temperature to civil war to just anything that the US as a country needs to do. Okay. We are finally finished with that section. I'm obviously not a crunchy hippie, so I didn't really like saying all of those things about ranked choice voting. It's time for a level-headed discussion of ranked choice voting. I truly hope that you don't really listen to anything that I just said. It was all nonsense. In fact, you need to beware of the utopian thinking that AF promotes. Ranked choice voting has structural issues like ballot exhaustion, a complicated voting system, a total lack of constitutional legitimacy, and we know some of the results. Voters will be disenfranchised and unsatisfied with the system, and given the incentives, will actually begin to elect more extreme candidates than in the status quo. However, extreme change to the basis of American democracy, a voting system that's been in place for 250 years, will also bring about a great many unintended consequences that nobody can predict. First argument is structural issues, some basic reasons we should reject RCV. The first is ballot exhaustion. Ballot exhaustion, remember, is when a ballot doesn't count towards the final winner, thus rendering the voter's decision moot and ultimately useless. And there's a big reason for that. RCV is overly complicated, and thus few people utilize all their rankings. Here's Sapolsky and Adams, 19. Ranked choice destroys clarity of political debate and forces voters to cast ballots in hypothetical future runoff elections. Not only is ranked choice voting too complicated, it disenfranchises voters because ballots that do not include the two ultimate finalists are cast aside to manufacture a faux majority for the winner. With ranked choice voting, a candidate whose support was too marginal to get into public debates may end up winning, eliminating the process that informs the electorate and forcing average American voters into a world of mixed strategy game theory. The issue of ballot exhaustion is so extreme that 1/2 or more of all ballots would not affect the final distribution. Here's a quote from DeSalvo 21. A study of San Francisco's 2011 mayoral contest found that 27% of first-round ballots were exhausted before the last round, meaning that these voters' ballots had zero impact on the final vote distribution that decided that election. This can change the outcome of elections. Kilgore et al. 19, quote, does the winner change as the extent of truncation increases? We find that even small amounts of truncation can alter elections, end quote. So, ranked choice voting first is just clearly not democratic. Second, ranked choice voting adds enough chaos and complexity into the voting system that gaming it would be far easier, using the multiplicity of options afforded on a single ballot to get candidates into office who do not deserve to be there. Here is Hans Sapolsky, who served for several years on the Federal Election Commission. This guy knows his stuff. Talk about evidence quality. Ranked choice voting also provides voters with an incentive to tactically game the system and falsify their preferences for candidates. In today's social media world, it would not seem that difficult to implement and coordinate such a strategy. It is easy to imagine sophisticated insiders and campaign consultants creating and employing such a strategy to reach their candidate supporters. Unquote. Now, for those who want to game the system, like the YAF side, RCV seems like a great thing. And for that reason, it might be worth interrogating the motives of those who seem particularly gung-ho about doing it. Alright, next, information deficits. The confusing strategy required to effectively vote under RCV means that voters who already know very little about the representatives they vote for will face an even higher information deficit. Here is Kripaw and Sigod. One is a policy director for a governor, the other a researcher at George Mason University. Quote, it's a long one, but very good explanation. Ranked choice voting entails a much more complicated and somewhat artificial decision. To fully participate, voters must rank order all of the candidates. This inherent feature of ranked choice voting is problematic because it demands that voters have a large amount of information about candidates' differing views. A voter, even one without strong feelings for or against certain candidates, may feel pressure to rank them anyway based on little more than random chance. It is well documented that American voters often lack basic information about candidates' policy positions. A Pew Research Center survey conducted shortly before the 2016 presidential election revealed that a significant proportion of registered voters knew little or nothing about where the two major candidates stood on key issues. End quote. So, in short, what this means for voters is that they must, 1, choose to invest many hours of research into each position and each candidate that they may vote for, thoroughly investigating not one or two but dozens of candidates, which is something that almost nobody will do, or not use their full votes and thus risking their vote not counting, or 3, make random choices and hope for the best. So in my book, all of these seem like very poor choices to move our political system in. A limited selection of candidates, which we have now, screened by primaries and debaters so we know they're okay at least, is a better way to make informed decision about candidates. Next, one citizen, one vote. This is constitutionality. Here, Breyer, 21, a lawyer, makes the case that RCV, again, lacks said constitutionality. The bedrock electoral principle undergirding the 14th Amendment's equal protection guarantee is that any one citizen has a constitutionally protected right to participate in an election on an equal basis with others. RCV affronts that principle. RCV is not just one election, it is multiple. RCV does not give equal opportunity to every voter, but rather enhances the efficacy of some votes to the detriment of others. When it does burden voting rights, RCV does so unequally by inflicting harsher burdens on voters of certain demographics. End quote. We'll talk about in the next section which demographics are hurt, but I'm sure you will not be shocked by the answers. Changes in the federal government can have large and unintended consequences. The federal government is the most powerful government, in charge of the most powerful country, the most powerful military, and the largest economy ever. We cannot just throw around dystopian hoops to revamp the federal system and just pray that nothing goes awry. Here is Daniel DeSalvo, a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute. Quote, even seemingly small changes to voting and party systems can have large unforeseen effects. As Harvard political scientist Edward Banfield noted long ago, if we change the political system in one respect, even a seemingly trivial one, we are likely to set in motion a succession of change which will not come to an end until the whole system has been changed. End quote. And John and Douglas, both experienced researchers who say that, quote, changes in electoral rules therefore have the potential to create new conflicts between candidates whose consequences can be difficult to predict. End quote. Our system has worked for hundreds of years. Ranked choice voting has never worked anywhere beyond a few minor elections in some places. If it's not broken, let's not fix it. Next arguments are about society. In addition to these major structural warnings of reforming our federal election system, there are some solid societal impacts that NEG should warn the judge about. First, disenfranchisement. Because certain voters aren't likely to use their whole ballot, those voters' decisions are less likely to count. Those who can't make sense of the complicated system and have spoiled ballots, their votes also won't count. So, here's the question, who gets hurt the most? Again, here's Cripon Sigod, 19, quote, research has found that jurisdictions with higher proportions of older voters are more likely to report ballot marking mistakes. African Americans, Latinos, voters with less education, those whose first language is not English, are more likely to be disenfranchised with a ranked choice voting system. Ranked choice voting increases the disparity between those who are already likely to vote and those who are not, including younger voters and those with lower levels of education. Quote. If we want to maintain a level playing field, we must maintain the status quo. Next, satisfaction. Unsurprisingly, people don't like this overly complicated voting system. Jesse Clark has a PhD in political science from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and he ran some experiments to check that out. Quote, the findings of the experiment were stark. I found that RCV produced significantly lower levels of voter confidence, voter satisfaction, and ease of use. It also increased the perception that the voting process was slanted against the respondent's party. Similarly, I found it increased the amount of time it took to vote by nearly 12 seconds per candidate. End quote. Again, the simplest of studies show a slew of reasons to not use RCV. When citizens' satisfaction with the system goes down, so does the legitimacy of the government, as citizens are less likely to feel that their vote was actually counted and that their government actually represents them. Our final slate of arguments is about governance. It's not about structural issues. We did that one already. I do remember. It's about governance. As AF was concerned with whether our government runs better or not, so should NEG be concerned with the very same thing. First, under RCV, there is no compromise. Under the current system, voters have to consider what others want. Who's the best leader for the country, not who's my personal favorite. Our current system, in other words, demands compromises. Ranked choice voting, which fails to penalize voters for marking anyone they like at the top of the ballot, will reduce compromise and result in worse governance. Harvey Mansfield is an American political philosopher and likely the most respected of all the authors in this brief. Quote, "Ranked choice voting is an attempt that has its own twist and will make elections worse for both parties. Each looks for ways to bring together difficult companions. Republicans must reconcile the interests of evangelical Christians and libertarians. Democrats must balance the desires of progressives and moderates. A good result from an election relies on its accuracy in representing the people's will. The voters should get not only what they want, like customers, but also what is good for them as citizens." End quote. However, failure to compromise is not the only way that RCV will worsen our political climate. RCV is actually more likely to elect extreme candidates. So, an example, you have a far right and a far left candidate and a moderate candidate. If the moderate candidate got all of the second place votes from all voters, they would be eliminated, leaving only the far right and far left candidates to duke it out for the prize. Here's Atkinson and Gantz 22, quote, "The ranked choice system that is being used around the country to conduct elections with more than two candidates is biased towards extreme candidates and away from moderate ones. This is just as important of an issue for the future of American democracy as the other important policy concerns surrounding voting in our country." End quote. Now, in considering NEG's strategy, remember that NEG does not have to completely disown ranked choice voting. Maybe some limited tests, some limited use would make sense. Take, 40, 50 years, try it out, see what happens. However, rolling out ranked choice voting to the entire nation's federal elections is a big move, and much more consequential than local elections for mayors, or even state elections for governors and legislatures. So there are plenty of cases to be made that, not that ranked choice voting in theory shouldn't work, but that we shouldn't do it now, we shouldn't do it soon. And certainly, you can work with some definitions to talk about this, but just in time frame, this thing should be enacted soon, right? Ranked choice voting for AFT really to win the debate. All right, that is it for NEG, and guess what? That is it for ranked choice voting, and guess what? That is it for the season. If you've made it this far, please leave a nice summer comment in the video below, maybe an emoji or a smiley face, or just say thanks, which you always do, and thank you for the thanks. As I mentioned in the email, I'm planning to start up a pretty affordable class next fall. If you're interested in it at all, please sign up at the link in the description and I'll send you the details. No obligation to sign up. Just if you want the details, I'll send them to you. To all of you, I wish you a beautiful summer and I wish you a life showered in love so that you can spread this love to the people around you. Goodbye.